to have you all here. So thank you all for coming. I'm Matilda McQuaid. I'm Acting Director of Curatorial, and I'd like to welcome you to our 5th program of the series Behind the Design. This is a lunchtime discussion for curators, conservators, educators, and other specialists to come together for conversation around our collection and exhibition. And it's an opportunity for you, the audience, to ask questions. So I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A part of this presentation. So you can see it down at the bottom, not the chat, but the Q&A. Also, just wanted to let you know that our next program, we have 2 programs this September, will be on September 28th. And we'll focus on the exhibition that we just opened a few days ago, Underground Modernist, E. McKnight Kauffer. And it's a must-see, so please come into the Cooper Hewitt if you are local or nearby. It's free to the public through October. So first, a big shout out to Phoebe Moore and Robin Carter, who are helping with this program today. And so on to the program. We're going to hear from Susan Brown, who's acting head of textiles, Alexa Griffith-Witten, who is manager, content, and curriculum at Cooper Hewitt. And they're curating the 2023 exhibition on Dorothy Liebes. And they are joined by Liza Curran, who's the interim director at the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art, and Erin Kinhart, who's the head of collections processing at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. And they recently digitized the Dorothy Liebes Papers at the archive. So welcome to you all, and let's talk Liebes.
Thank you, Matilda, and thank you all so much for joining us. As Matilda mentioned, we're here to celebrate the recently completed digitization of the Dorothy Liebes Papers at the Archives of American Art, generously funded by the Coby Foundation. For the first time, the complete papers are available to the public online, and no one is more thrilled than Alexa and me as we prepare for the first monographic exhibition on Dorothy Liebes in over 50 years. The papers help us to understand the breadth and scope of her career, which was huge, but also to look more holistically at mid-century design, because Dorothy Liebes was truly woven through every aspect of the design field, from domestic and commercial interiors to industrial design to fashion and film. So we're going to start with a brief 5-minute overview of her career for those of you who may be less familiar with her life and work. And then I'll have some questions for our panel. And at the end, we'll have time for questions from the audience. So please put those in the Q&A box. We would also love to hear from you if you knew Dorothy Liebes or anyone who worked in her studio. So we'll drop an email in the chat where you can reach us. Dorothy Liebes was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. She studied art at UC Berkeley and art education at Columbia. But it was after studying weaving that she developed a vision and an ambition for the prominent role that textiles could play in the modern interior. Over a period of 40 years, from when she opened her first studio in the early 1930s until her death in 1972, her approach to textiles was instrumental in defining the look and feel of American modernism. You're having some technical issues?
Sorry, please be patient. My internet is saying it's a little bit unstable, which is unusual for me. So I'm hoping it's momentary, but that's the lag in getting the presentation up. Give me just 1 sec, please.
I'll keep going in case, because we have such a short amount of time here. So architecture was one of Dorothy's great passions, and she aligned herself early on with some of the most important architects and interior designers of her time, including Frank Lloyd Wright, Henry Dreyfuss, Donald Deskey, William Paulman, Francis Elkins, Samuel Marks. Liebes felt that modern architecture, with its vast expanses of glass, required a completely new textile vocabulary. With her woven blinds and screening fabrics, she offered solutions to practical issues of privacy and light mitigation. Although we associate her with the indoor-outdoor California modern look, by the 1940s, her textiles were synonymous with sophistication and glamour from Honolulu to New York, as you see in these examples from the Royal Hawaiian Hotel and Raymond Loewy's apartment. There we go. Thanks, Alexa. She also contributed to the spatial arrangement of rooms with freestanding screens, movable space dividers, and rigid translucent panels formed from textiles and acrylic, like this wall in the Arthur Keating apartment designed by Samuel Marks. Go ahead. And these retractable screens for the United Nations Delegates Dining Room. Next. Although Liebes is known for her love of color, she did design for several clients with important art collections where she used texture and metallic sparkle to convey luxury. As far as we know, Doris Duke's Honolulu home, Shangri-La, is the only interior where the Liebes fabrics remain in place as they were originally installed. Next. She was a close friend of Frank Lloyd Wright and worked with him on his home and studio, Taliesin, the Usonian Exhibition House, the Price Tower in Oklahoma, and other interiors. So, how does such a prominent designer come to be so little known? Most of the time, Liebes's work was reproduced in halftone prints like the image in the center. It's only in the interior designer's rendering on the left that you see the critical role of color in that space, which is carried entirely by the textiles. And by encountering the textiles themselves, that you understand the tactile experience of being in that space. The images also fail to convey the seductive glimmer of metallic fibers, one of Liebes's signature materials, as they were activated by natural and artificial light. By using archives in conjunction with museum collections, we can begin to piece together different types of documents that together illuminate just how central textiles were to the design of these spaces. Next. In addition to interior fabrics, Liebes created textiles for fashion designers, Pauline Trégère, Claire Potter, and Bonnie Cashin, women designers associated with the American style of functional clothes for active women. And for those who love the look but not the price, Liebes fabrics were also used by a variety of hat, bag, and shoe manufacturers and distributed at department stores nationwide, including the Stoles on the right by Carol Stanley. The model you see there is photographed in Dorothy Liebes' studio, posed in front of her ram's head loom, which today is in Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Next. The Liebes look was also disseminated through Hollywood films. Her fabrics and woven blinds were used for the sets of the Hepburn Tracy romantic comedy Adam's Rib and the Barbara Stanwyck nightclub noir East Side, West Side. Next. She designed custom woven fabrics for costumes created by Hollywood designers like Adrian, Edith Head, and Travis Banton, and worn by stars like Lucille Ball, seen here in promotional photos for the film Lover Come Back. Next. Liebes was deeply committed to making good design accessible to all, and eventually she gave up her lucrative custom fabrics business to create hand-woven samples for interpretation on industrial looms at affordable prices. She became a color and design consultant to a dozen US firms, including DuPont, Doe Beckman, and Dow Chemical, who sought her expertise and leveraged her reputation as a tastemaker to help them build markets for new materials like Orlon, Dacron, and Lurex. Liebes's reach extended to industrial and transportation design, including passenger ships, automobiles, and airplanes. She worked with her friend Henry Dreyfuss on a range of projects, including the American Airlines flagship 747 and the luxury passenger ships SS Independence and Constitution. This letter from the archives captures the personal side of their relationship, reading, "Did you ever get 1,000,000 carnations we sent you for your birthday?" with a hand-drawn sketch of a red carnation. Next. Liebes designed nearly all the fabrics, both hand and power loomed, for the SS United States, the lightning-fast luxury passenger ship that in many ways embodied the American economic, industrial, and cultural dominance after World War II. This piece in Cooper Hewitt's collection will be the subject of today's Behind the Design discussion. So, Liza, can you tell us how the Dorothy Liebes Archive came to be at the Archives of American Art? And how did Liebes come to the top of your list for digitization?
Sure. First, I want to thank Susan and Alexa and Cooper Hewitt for shining such a bright light on Dorothy Liebes. And Aaron and I are so pleased to participate in this celebration. As Susan mentioned, it's really surprising that she isn't better known, but she is known to us very well at the Archives of American Art because her collection is one of the most heavily used of personal business papers. And the story of how they came to the archives is really one of our effort to document the history of the visual arts through collecting primary sources. In the 1960s, our director then, Bill Wolfenden, knew her as a distinguished textile designer. There was also a personal connection because the president of our board of trustees, Russell Lyons, was the managing editor of Harper's Magazine, and he knew both Dorothy Liebes and her husband, Relman Morin, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning Associated Press correspondent. And following Russell Lyons' lead, we reached out to Liebes in October 1968 to ask her about her papers and the possibility of us microfilming them. And she was on board with the project, but before it could come to fruition, she died. And we took up the conversation with her husband in November 1972, and we visited the Liebes studio on Lexington Avenue and met with him and also Ralph Higbee, who was the director of her studio. And the papers came to the Archives New York office between December 1972 and March 74. And they've been available to researchers at our DC office ever since. But Kathy Gaines, an archivist on our staff, produced the first finding aid. And then last year, the arrangement was refined by Stephanie Ashley with funding from the Terra Foundation for American Art. And this year, we digitized the entire collection with funding from the Coby Foundation. And this is a foundation that specifically funds projects in the field of textile and needle arts. So we're particularly grateful to have this funding because the collection is one of our most frequently consulted. And so it makes perfect sense for us to make it available online. And what perfect timing with your retrospective exhibition. So we're doubly pleased that this has come to fruition now.
I think it's amazing that her papers are so frequently requested. And I think it really speaks to what a key place she plays in the mid-century design story. So after Dorothy Liebes died, Ralph Higbee dispersed the textiles remaining in the studio to universities and museums across the country, including Cooper Hewitt. But I can say from experience that they mostly came with very little information about the specific projects that they were created for. So a lot of textile collections like Cooper Hewitt's will really come to life and be given new layers of meaning by the information in this archive. Alexa, you have spent a lot of time in the archive visiting in person. As a design historian, can you tell us how you first fell down the Liebes rabbit hole?
Yeah, it's a very specific moment that I will never forget in my life and in my career. I was doing some research at the Metropolitan Museum. I was doing some writing for their timeline of art history, and they let me kind of run loose in their files for my research. And I came across a tag for a Liebes panel that had been for the United Nations. A project that she had done for the United Nations. And my research is American design history primarily, especially interior design. I was really familiar with that United Nations project. And of course, I had never heard of her. We're all very familiar with that famous photo of all the male architects. That's sort of how the Le Corbusier and all the rest kind of fighting to get to design the UN. And that's sort of how design history has represented that project. So I became really, really interested in finding out more. And it was difficult to find out more, but it started this kind of cascade of research. And, the first line of approach was, things like textbooks and design history, and there's very little about Liebes there. So then New York Times archive, and then there's more, and I'm starting to see more and more. Oh, she worked in fashion. Oh, she was, often covered in terms of the home section of the New York Times, often had her. But almost immediately I could see that the history of design was not like what I was finding, even in those first sort of fishing expeditions, was not at all reflected in the history of American design. So that made me even more curious. And so the first time I was able to get funding to go to the Archives of American Art, that was really like, it was almost like these doors keep opening one after another, if you achievement unlocked, if you work hard, and, and so there are many, and that was really, at that time, they were only minimally processed. So it is really truly such a thrill that they are digitized now and organized so beautifully. But even previous to their processing, it was so incredible to just open a box, and then you find this correspondence, and you start to see how central she was to the story of American design. And her network of contacts and friends are all well-known names to those of us who study design history. So it's Henry Dreyfuss, Frank Lloyd Wright, also Frances Elkins in the interior design sector. But then you start to also see all of the ways she intersected with it through the hand weaving, which is probably the best known, but through the industrial design, through the studio that she called a laboratory, through her work in fashion, which she didn't talk about a lot, but actually, as you and I are discovering, there's quite a lot left to learn and to study about that. And then, of course, the film, which was a revelation. So, almost the more I kind of dug in, the more rewarding it was. But I also quickly realized that I was going to have to be very creative as a researcher, and that a lot of the periodicals, and this has changed. I started this in 2007, 8, something like that. And a lot has changed since then. But when I first started this, shelter magazines in general, like House and Garden, House Beautiful, which are so important to design history, were not indexed. Handweaver and Craftsman was a really important publication for her, not indexed. So I had to be really creative. And, eBay was a little bit of an archive for me. And I bought a lot of stuff on eBay. And then, so I had to, because design history was not kind of reflecting her at all, I had to be really creative about how I kind of tried to pull together that information. But I did, and I continue, as I spend time with you on this project and thinking about Liebes, feel so compelled to do my very best to share the work of this incredible designer. And so I worked really hard to do that through publications or whatever. It was never enough, but I wanted to kind of get her story out there in the way that I could, because I do feel that this is a story that is necessary to the history of modern design. And so it's really such a thrill and an honor to be here today to talk with all of you about Liebes, but also to be working on this retrospective after so many decades of her, really not having that opportunity to share her work with a broad public.
Yes, and Alexa has published some excellent articles in the past on Dorothy Liebes, and we will share those citations with you in our follow-up email after this program. For now, let's return to that drapery panel that we showed you from the SS United States as an example of this hunting process. So Erin, can you tell us about the various places in the archive where documents about this project are hidden away?
Yes, so most of the documents about the projects such as the SS United States panels are found within the collection's large series of subject files. They span over 8 linear foot boxes of material, and the subject files are based on Liebes' original arrangement and contain correspondence, printed material, photographs, memoranda, forms, and other types of varying combinations. They focus heavily on her consultation work for businesses in the textile industry, including many files on her work with DuPont, Goodall, Dow, and others. Documentation on the SS United States panels are somewhat hidden within the subject files. You do have to do a little bit of digging around and look at specific dates, of course, There is a register of orders from 1949 to 1951 that includes panel orders in 1950 for this project, but frustratingly, it gives very minimal details on the materials that were part of the project. Later in the 1950s, her documentation practices seem to have changed, and in the files called Orders Completed from 1958 to 1967, there are a sequence of memos, order confirmation forms, and purchase orders that give many more details and bring to light the work she did in 1960 for an upholstery project for the same ship. There's another group of folders in the subject files called Studio Business that primarily contain letters and memos from studio employees to Liebes when she was away. These letters are another good source of information on the decision-making processes for fabricating samples and selecting yarns and dyes for projects such as this one. Liebes also documented her work and professional achievements in a series of 33 scrapbooks, which are very fragile and difficult to serve in the reading room. So I'm happy we can bring these to researchers digitally now. But they provide a great visual timeline for her projects. Her 1952 scrapbook includes several clippings about the interiors and innovative fabrics used for the SS United States. And then one last hidden reference to the project is in her 450-page draft of her unpublished memoir. She mentions this project specifically, her work on the SS United States ballroom curtains and the blue and green color palette that she used for the project.
I have to say the Studio Business folders are my favorite because Liebes was traveling all of the time, and for a period of years she had a studio both in New York and in San Francisco. So her employees were constantly writing letters to her detailing their progress on various projects. It's where they get into the nitty-gritty about our drapery, like what yarns they can use in the warp to minimize stretching over time, what dyes they need to use to prevent fading in this intensely sunny environment of a ship. But it also puts into writing the day-to-day concerns of the studio, the kind of thing that normally goes completely undocumented. So we know from the press clippings that Liebes and Dreyfus collaborated on the SS Independence, but we know from Studio Business that they were worried about being able to do it at the price that Dreyfus needed, and that they considered it to be such a prestigious commission that they thought they should do it anyway, even if they could only break even. So as excited as we are about the things that are in the archive, of course, there are also things that are maddeningly missing. For example, we have these letters from the studio to Dorothy Liebes, but not her responses, even though both parties seem to type everything up in duplicate for the purposes of record keeping. There's also no correspondence with Bonnie Cashin, who was one of her closest friends and collaborators. Liza, from your years of experience working with artist archives, do you have any theories about why some things, even things that are not terribly personal, are held back?
Well, Susan, it's always the case that archives are incomplete, and it's and this is a very extensive collection. So it's always those, those veins of research that you're pursuing that somehow they've disappeared. We don't really know in this case if there's materials held back for personal reasons, but there is a note in our file from November 1972 stating that Liebes's husband, Relman Morin, he destroyed the correspondence that was in the home because he considered it to be irrelevant. So could have been some of the things you're looking for. We don't know. I mean, concerning her business, the studio, there are letters from Liebes's studio staff beginning in 1952, as you probably know, but we can only speculate about what happened to the earlier responses. And, so some of the correspondence has been destroyed or lost. The collection still includes a depth of personal and business correspondence, thousands of letters, maybe not the one you need. There's always that case. From about 1922 to 1973, the studio the year after her death. But there's always missing pieces. And that's the that's the real enterprise of art history and design history, is to make those informed leaps when the primary sources don't exist.
Yes, and you are absolutely right. There are thousands and thousands of letters. And when I look at the sheer volume of her correspondence, I can't believe she had time to do anything else. So needless to say, Alexa and I are very excited about Dorothy Liebes, but she is no doubt one of many women designers who have been rendered invisible in the design histories that have been written so far. So as a question for all of you, how do you think that the digitization of the Liebes archive and others like it will impact design scholarship more broadly? Erin, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. So digitization allows for global access to this archive and provides just a starting point for digital scholarship. These online documents can now be contributed to crowdsourcing projects such as the Smithsonian Transcription Center, which is what I'm very excited about, as next steps. And this makes it even easier to find the connections between the people and the projects within the papers. Educators can use the digital images in their classrooms or share thematic content through the Smithsonian Learning Lab. And curators can use the content for virtual exhibition purposes. So there's a great deal of potential for new online storytelling opportunities and collaborations that tell the design history directly from the documents.
Thank you. Liza?
Well, now that the collection's available online, as Erin mentioned, it's much more easy to make relationships and discover these relationships that were more difficult to find before. And for instance, we recently acquired the papers of Emma Amos, and we know that she worked in Liebes's studio, and there is some material there, but we were having a hard time seeing Emma Amos in Dorothy Liebes's papers. But within the desk diaries and calendars, there you can really see how involved Amos was in the day-to-day operations of the studio. And beginning in the early 1960s, she's frequently mentioned in these diaries. And the diaries were kept by her staff because Liebes traveled so often that they kept a record of what was happening so that she could be informed of the what was going on in the studio. And there's particularly information about Emma Amos's connection with new rug designs and also their very close personal relationship, because Emma Amos was married in Liebes's studio. And, you know, there are moments in the diary marking parties and marking the celebration of her wedding day, which was May 1st, 1965. And for the history of design, the collection provides a real wealth of details about the development of her thought process and methods. And this is revealed through extensive reports, memos to clients and other customers, and particularly in the subject files. And the papers also show relationships and connections between individuals in the design world that were previously maybe not so highlighted. And for example, the exchange between Henry Dreyfuss and Liebes in June of 1961, it really reveals their mutual efforts to provide opportunities for each other on the projects they participated in. So there was a great sense of collaboration that is revealed in these papers that might not otherwise have been so evident. And now that they're online, I think it will be easier for people to make those connections.
Absolutely. Alexa?
Sure, I will absolutely echo everything that my colleagues have said, but I would like to extend that to, the real vital and central role that the archives materials play in establishing the career that she had and the history that she had, which is, as you mentioned, Susan, in the beginning, her work is sort of atomized across a number of institutions and not clearly documented in many cases. And then incompletely documented in the public record. And without the archives of American art, this incredibly deep and long career, I think the full spectrum of it would not be able to be surfaced. And so this very important voice and participant in the formation and conversations around American design would be missing. And, to me, that is what is so exciting about having these papers digitized and accessible anywhere, also the condition, with mid-century things, every time I would go down there, I felt like I was killing them a little bit because of just the paper that was used and everything. So it's a huge relief to know that they are accessible and safe. But I would also just like to point out that this is somebody who was at the apex of privilege and power. She was this beautiful blonde white woman who was, wealthy from and successful from a very early point in her life. And yet still so quickly she was really brushed off and erased from the history of design. And so, we as historians, I think, need to really pay attention to this because it speaks to much greater absences that need to be looked at. And for all the design historians in the audience, this is such an exciting time because there is so much opportunity to continue to surface these important contributions. And I think the papers from the Dorothy Liebes archive are going to be so important to many stories that have yet to be fully articulated.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Liza and Erin and Alexa, for this conversation. At this point, I think we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So there seem to be quite a few.
So I'll just kind of share a few. The first one, did Dorothy collaborate or work with the design, or actually, did you all collaborate or work with the Design Center at Philadelphia University on this project? Because they have, I guess, a massive Liebes collection.
Yes, our wonderful master's fellow has been in correspondence with the archive there. The Design Center at Philadelphia University is one of many universities that received large gifts of these sample swatches that Liebes called idea fabrics. And I think she very deliberately sort of planted them like seeds at all of the textile programs across the country, from RISD to UC Berkeley, which actually has almost 800 of these samples.
Another question, can you just talk briefly about some of her early life? And was she a weaver? I assume she was. There's the loom. How did she come to weaving?
Sure. She started weaving really young. She talks in the memoirs, which there's a question in the chat. The memoirs are digitized and available. And this is sort of the skeleton of her life that we work really closely from. But she put together a loom and started weaving, and it sounds like she fell right into it. She was really creative. Originally, she had thought she was going to be an artist, but soon she saw opportunities in textile design and weaving specifically. So she honed in on that very, very early. And there was a really interesting and kind of creative subculture there in the Bay Area. And she learned from a Swedish weaver called Mama Gravander, who was doing tutorials in traditional Swedish crafts, and other places where she was constantly learning about weaving. And then she studied design at UC Berkeley. So it seems like she was bitten by the bug very, very early.
Next question, have you seen anything about the rose panels done for the ballroom of the Queen Mary?
No,
not yet. Go ahead.
There are some photographs in the archive that may be those panels, but those are, Susan and I have been working really hard and together with our fellow to try and uncover some of these transportation projects, which are so central and so important, but really not that well documented. So we hope to have more information on those.
Next,
I'm just going to interject briefly. I see so many wonderful memories and connections to Liebes in the chat, and I did put my email in there. So if you would like to thank you for everyone who's done that, but if you would like to talk about this further, which obviously we do too, please do reach out to us. So thank you for everyone who's done that, but please do reach out, and I'll put my email in the chat again.
Great. Do you know anything about her relationship to Nell, and I'm going to bungle this, Nemorowski, who was a weaving teacher at FIT?
Yes, Nell was involved in the curation of the retrospective exhibition in 1970. at what was then the American Craft Museum, today the Museum of Arts and Design. That was, as I mentioned, the last monographic exhibition on Dorothy Liebes. And she wrote for the catalog, and I'm not sure if they had a relationship before that. Alexa, do you know?
Yeah, I don't know. That's the what I know.
Was she influenced by Annie Albers? Did she know Annie Albers?
Yes.
There are letters in the archive, the wonderful archive, between Annie Albers and Dorothy Liebes. Liebes was going to be in North Carolina at a conference or something, and Annie Albers, who was at Black Mountain College at that time, wrote to her and said, "Oh, I hear you're going to be in the area. I'd love to meet," and a response back and forth. So we know that they did admire each other's work and have some correspondence, and that they did meet in person. But I don't know beyond that about inspiration per se.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just add quickly that she did know the Cranbrook Circle of Weavers and so on, but she was much closer to Scandinavian weavers and had long friendships with Elsa Gullberg. And so that seems to be more of the orbit that she was in personally with other textile design.
Next question, does the archive include physical fabric swatches and other materials?
It does. We do have a series of textile samples from the studio. They were given to us probably much in the same way they were given to other Cooper Hewitt and others, with minimal descriptions, but most do have a alphanumeric number, like sequence on them, that we have arranged them in that way for the archives, and you can view those online as well. So those have been digitized and are available in the finding aid.
Great. Next question, going forward, will the textile documentation and the archive be married to the textiles in the various museum collections? Will they somehow be interconnected?
Well, that's the dream, of course. But it is, as Liza said, the work of art history to make those connections and to do that data entry so that the relationships between the archival materials and the museum collections are captured in the cataloging of the museum collection objects.
Next question, is there any mention of Liebes connecting with Joseph Eichler, who developed the mid-century modern homes in Northern California?
We have not found anything about a connection between Eichler and Liebes. She did, in terms of kind of modular home or mid-century design along those lines, she did do the textiles for Frank Lloyd Wright's model Usonian that he built on the site of what is now the Guggenheim. But to our knowledge, don't know that she was connected with Eichler.
How many staff members did she have in her office? And how many of those were designers?
I would say it varied between 12 and 20 at different times, including, people who did the books and, responded to all of this client correspondence, as well as weavers, dyers, and so on. And there were other designers working in the studio. As Liza mentioned, Emma Amos seems to have been very, very involved in the carpet designs in the 1960s, specifically for Bigelow carpets. And Tamas Keefe, who went on to have a very prominent career as a print designer, worked in the studio for some time. So a lot of people came and went, and some people stayed for a long time. But she, even from the very beginning, it was a studio of 12 to 15 people.
Great. So here's one who's thanking for such an inspirational event. As a designer and educator, she's interested in Dorothy Liebes's craft program for World War II veterans. Have you uncovered anything of this in your research? And does it appear in digitized collections or in the archives?
You want to take that, Alexa?
Yes, the answer is yes to all. And in fact, we had a wonderful art table fellow this summer who was specifically researching Liebes's work on arts and skills. It was a program that she initiated. And again, this is one of those incredible programs or incredible contributions that she made that has sort of fallen from the record. And it was aimed at, inspired according to her memoir, by seeing the injured servicemen come back from Hawaii after Pearl Harbor, and thinking that, weaving was very much a solace for her personally. She talked about how it calmed the nerves, and she wanted to set up a craft program for servicemen as a kind of, they didn't talk about PTSD at that time, but it was that type of somatic therapy, and also a little bit professional. And there is a scrapbook in the Archives of American Art that is dedicated to the work that she did with arts and skills. It was a huge program with many collaborators. And that research is ongoing, and we're hoping to uncover more. The National Archives has actual samples that servicemen made under this program, but there is information and there is correspondence in the archives. So we are, it is vital, and we're looking forward to more research about that. Great.
Does the Bonnie Cashin archive have correspondence between the two of them?
Yes. The keeper of the Bonnie Cashin flame and Bonnie Cashin archive has been a wonderful partner in this research, and incredibly generous in sharing her knowledge, her vast knowledge of Cashin, and also the friendship between Cashin and Liebes. They were both from California. They were very good friends, and they also collaborated. And we have, Stephanie Lake has very generously shared with us some wonderful correspondence that she has from the Cashin archive that documents that friendship, which is a really wonderful piece to have, because as was mentioned previously, it's not in the Liebes papers.
Next question. Did religion play any part in her design career? Any not that you know.
That has not emerged in the papers. I don't know about her personally.
Okay. And then did Dorothy or her studio donate the swatches to the institutions?
This happened after she died. So she passed away in 1972, and then there was a little bit of uncertainty about how to proceed next. But in the end, Ralph Higbee, who was mentioned, who was the studio manager in New York, sort of divvied everything up into groups of 5 or 6 large panels and 100 samples, and distributed those to institutions, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Cooper Hewitt, the National Museum of American History, and a bunch of universities that have been mentioned, including RISD and the one in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia College of Textiles, and the Moore College of Art, I think, and several in California, her home state.
Who has the rights to interpret her designs for fabric or wall coverings for residential and commercial use?
As always, that's a tricky question. The studio itself was disbanded after her death, and so it wasn't, like so many textile companies are purchased by another company. That didn't happen. The studio was just closed and disbanded, and she did not have any children. She did do a lot of work for some major corporations like Goodall and Bigelow Sanford, and so those companies may have some rights in the work that she created for them. But otherwise, there's no, as far as I know, no rights holder for the Dorothy Liebes in her own right.
Couple more questions. Was there any mention of Evelyn Ackerman, who also was a mid-century designer of textiles? She was active from the mid-50s to the early 80s.
That's not a name I recall coming across. Doesn't mean it's not there.
Yes. As Erin said, sometimes things are hidden away. But we'll keep an eye out, and if we find it, we'll let you know.
And then I guess another person, someone asked if she worked with Trudy Gehrman-Prey, whom we also have the archives for, but I don't know.
They did know each other. We know that from the archives, but they did not collaborate to my knowledge.
Next question, were the blinds all hand woven? This is Peggy Osterkamp. I have the shuttles she used for weaving the blinds.
Really?
Wow, Peggy.
Wow, Peggy, that's fabulous. Yes, most of the blinds were hand woven. And there are great pictures of them being woven in the studio. And there's a lot of correspondence about needing a wider loom to make super wide blinds. She did at some point provide hand woven samples to Columbia Blinds for some more commercially manufactured blinds, but all of the ones that you see in the pictures that we've shown and others are hand woven in the studio.
Okay, maybe one last question. Do you know of any sort of contemporary analogs to Liebes, textile designers now who are working in a similar style?
Not just one. Yes, but many.
Yeah.
I mean, her exploration with materials is something that I think, and Susan and I have discussed this. I think if she were working now, she would be 100% dedicated to sustainable materials for textiles. So I think that's something that really resonates.
Yes, and I think that she was extremely influential, and the Liebes look has, persisted into our time in the interest in mid-century modern design. So the sort of nubby, hand-woven, heavily textural fabrics as a counterbalance to the clean shapes and cool materials, I think is something that has had a lasting impact.
Great. Okay. I think we're over our time and there's still questions. So please, you have the emails for Susan and Alexa in the chat. Please, keep them coming, and also memories for those. And if you have any textiles that you're looking to put in a safer place, remember Cooper Hewitt. And anyway, thank you all for coming. This was fantastic. Thank you, panelists. Can't wait for the Dorothy Liebes show to be up in 2 years. Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.